Yes, Steven! It's so appealing.
It was the night before Christmas Eve and the snow was falling thick and fast. All around Santa's factory there were busy elves running to and fro carrying things. Some had beautifully decorated parcels ready to be delivered. Others were carrying toys to the wrapping department, where more elves were waiting with their rolls of paper and shiny bows. It was a hive of activity. As the elves ran by, they didn't see the pair of eyes that watched them from one of the doorways. The eyes blinked and went wide with amazement every time a new toy was carried past. As soon as the activity died down, the owner of the eyes crept out of the doorway into the snowy night. The big brown eyes belonged to one of the most good-looking but smallest reindeers in the land, and now he stood in full view, gradually being covered by some of the millions of flakes of snow that were falling from the dark night sky. The little reindeer's name was Tink. Everyone called him Tink, except his mum and dad, who called him Tinker. They said it was because he was a little tinker who was forever getting into mischief. But Tink wasn't a bad little reindeer. He was just filled with curiosity and wonder about the world, and wanted to learn as much as he could. Tink had a secret wish too. One day he wanted to make his mum and dad proud by becoming one of the reindeers that pulled Santa's sleigh all around the world on Christmas Eve, delivering presents to all the boys and girls. He didn't know whether he would ever be able to do that because he knew the reindeers on Santa's air service, otherwise known as the SAS, were some of the best trained and toughest reindeers in the world. But he had lots of hope and kept thinking positive thoughts and believed that one day he too would wear one of those special harnesses with the badge on it. If that happened, he would think himself one of the luckiest reindeers alive. For tonight though, all he could do was dream and watch everything that was going on in preparation for the big night. Tink crept along the side of the building, being careful to stay in the shadows so he wasn't seen. Pretty soon he came up to a huge set of doors. He was a bit scared now because he knew this was where Santa's sleigh and his special reindeers were kept. But he saw that the doors were open and the building was empty, so he drew a deep breath and relaxed a little bit. He puffed out his little reindeer chest and trotted into the shed whilst no one was looking. The shed was huge. On one side there were stables where Santa's reindeers slept. On the other side there were all manner of tools and spare parts for the sleigh. But then Tink saw something really special. At the back of the shed, hanging on large golden hooks, were the Christmas Eve reindeer harnesses. He'd never seen them this closely before because he was normally in bed when Santa and his reindeers made their delivery run. They were spectacular. He walked up to the wall and looked at them with wide, longing eyes. The harnesses were made of soft black leather with buckles of the purest gold, and the tiny bells fastened to the straps ding-a-linged when the wind blew through the open doors. And there in the centre was the chief reindeer harness, complete with the badge that Tink longed to wear one day. It was in the shape of a golden box that was tied up with a bow like a Christmas present, and on each side of the box was a golden wing. And underneath was the motto of Santa's air service: "Who cares, flies." It was one of the most beautiful things Tink had ever seen. Tink was lost in his dreams when all at once he heard a noise behind him. What started as a faint whoosh grew louder and louder, then turned into a deep rumble. He ran to the open doors and was suddenly blinded by the landing strip lights. Santa's sleigh was coming into land after a practice run. Tink knew that the practice runs were very important because the more you practice something, the better you'll be able to do it in the future. He thought about running for the door, but it was too late. Santa was on final approach, and a few seconds later the sleigh came into view with the reindeers now pulling it along the ground, throwing a cloud of powdery snow up on both sides. Gradually the sleigh slowed and finally came to rest just outside the doors. By this time Tink was hiding behind a large box in the corner, but he couldn't resist peeking out. It was a wonderful sight. The sleigh was huge and was a dazzling mix of red, black and gold, and seemed to have 1,000 bells on it. It also glowed with a strange light which was nothing like Tink had ever seen before. Santa sat at the front, dusting snow off his tunic and pulling icicles off his long flowing beard. But although that was a magnificent thing to see, it was the reindeers that Tink was most impressed by. They stood in front of the sleigh with clouds of steam rising from their backs, eyes ablaze and heads bobbing with pride. And most impressive of all was the reindeer at the front. It was Rudolph. As the group slowly pulled the sleigh inside, Tink got a much better view, and now Rudolph was only a few feet away, towering above Tink's hiding place, with his red nose still glowing faintly. All of the reindeers looked wonderful, but Rudolph was the chief reindeer. Tink hoped that one day he too would hold that special title. After Santa had unharnessed the reindeers, Rudolph walked forward a few paces. Tink watched as he lifted his head, sniffed the cold air and then frowned. Then Rudolph turned and stared straight at Tink's hiding place. Tink trembled with fear. Rudolph was a legend among all of the other reindeers and everybody respected him. Tink gulped and thought, I'm in real trouble now. He knew this place was off limits to young reindeers. Rudolph continued to stare for a moment, then his deep voice boomed out. I can smell you, young reindeer. Come out here and let us take a look at you. Tink plucked up courage and walked out into the open. All reindeer eyes were now upon him. So what do we have here? Said Rudolph. Prancer looked over Rudolph's shoulder. Well, it's a reindeerling by the looks of it. What's he doing here? Doesn't he know the rules? Dancer walked up and joined in. I'm hungry after all that work. Can we eat him? There aren't any rules saying we can't. Yep, my belly's growling, said Donna. Tink's eyes grew wider and wider, but then he heard a low chuckle from the back of the group. As Santa walked forward, it turned into a full-blown ho ho ho. Santa elbowed Rudolph and said, Stop teasing the poor young lad. Look at him, he's frightened. Rudolph began to look a bit sheepish, which was a little bit strange, because, well, he's a reindeer. Then he too began to chuckle. What are you doing here, young lad? He said in a kinder voice that put Tink at ease. I was just curious, sir. I wanted to see where you live, because one day when I'm bigger, I want to be just like you and the other reindeers here. Rudolph nodded wisely and looked at Santa. It appears we have a very brave sleigh reindeer of the future here, boss. We had better keep an eye on him. Santa laughed again. The ho 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 seemed to completely surround and go through Tink, which was to be expected, he supposed, as it was a magical laugh. Everything about Santa was magical. Rudolph was studying Tink and said, Okay, young man, you'd best be off. We need to rest to get ready for tomorrow night. But as you're so eager to learn, we'll allow you one question. Only one, mind, so make it a good one. Tink paused for a moment and seemed deep in thought. I have one question, he said. The sleigh reindeers and Santa all leaned forward. Go on then, said Rudolph. Well, I know that you reindeers pull Santa's sleigh, but what I really want to know is... Yes, they all said, leaning more towards Tink. Well, how does Santa's sleigh fly? Santa's reindeer stood very still and said nothing. Then Rudolph turned to Santa and raised his eyebrows. Santa just smiled and nodded. Then Santa walked forward, and as he did, he reached into his pocket. As he stood in front of Tink, he bent down and took his hand back out with something clutched tightly within it. Well, my young lad, he said, you may just have asked one of the most important questions there is to ask. Santa leaned down towards Tink and opened his hand. Tink looked and saw a key. But it wasn't just any key. It was the most beautiful key he'd ever seen. It was made of solid gold and glowed just like the sun. And at the end, where someone would hold it, was a heart-shaped jewel of the deepest red. "This, my young fellow," Santa said, "is what makes my sleigh fly." "But how?" said Tink. "I'll show you," said Santa. And with that he walked back to the sleigh. Santa climbed into his seat and placed the key into a keyhole next to him. Right away there was a strange noise which oddly seemed loud and quiet at the same time, and the sleigh began to glow with blue light. Then Santa's face became serious and he looked straight at Tink. "I'm trusting you with something that not everyone knows, young reindeer. This key is a magical key, and its jewel is shaped like a heart, because it was made from a part of the heart of the world many thousands of Christmases ago, when the world was born. It carries all of the love that the world has for its children, and because of that, it makes my sleigh fly, so we can bring happiness to all of the children in every different country there is. Without this key, we simply couldn't travel fast enough to deliver presents to every child on earth in one night." Tink was silent for a moment. Then he summoned up some more courage. "Santa, may I please help deliver the presents tomorrow night?" The spell was broken and Santa roared with laughter. "Well, my fine young chap," he said, "you certainly have a big heart too, but I fear you may still be a bit too young for such an adventure. Come back to me when you're a bit older and we'll see what we can do." With that, Santa turned and walked out of the building, leaving Tink feeling sad that he could not help on Christmas Eve. Rudolph saw the look on Tink's face and said, "Chin up, lad. It won't be long before you'll be leading all of us. Now get yourself home to bed. You can wave us off tomorrow night if you want, and then see us back in on Christmas morning. Just tell the elves that I said so." Tink nodded sadly and walked slowly towards the door. Before he left, he turned to look over his shoulder. All of Santa's reindeers were looking at him with the kindest eyes he'd ever seen. He went on his way with a warm feeling inside that helped him shrug off the cold of the night. The next day was Christmas Eve, and the daytime went by in a flash because everyone was so busy. Soon the nighttime came, and once again the snow was falling, but much more heavily than the night before. The wind was also beginning to howl and moan all around. Tink was walking around watching the hustle and bustle, and overheard two of the elves talking. "It's a rough night tonight," said one. "Yes, Santa's going to have a very difficult delivery run," said the other. Tink continued onto the sleigh shed, where lots of people were gathering to see Santa and his crew off. The reindeers looked glorious in their full official Christmas Eve harnesses, and the sleigh looked quite spectacular, filled full as full can be with all manner of wrapped parcels. Tink moved closer and tried to get near the reindeers, but there were too many people. But at that moment, Rudolph spotted him and winked. He then nudged the other reindeers, who all nodded to Tink. Tink was so pleased. He almost felt like part of the crew. But wait, he thought. He could help, he was sure of it. An extra set of hooves always comes in handy in most situations. But if he asked, they would just say no, wouldn't they? Tink walked around the back of the sleigh and spotted an opportunity. There, in between some of the parcels, was a small space, just big enough for a reindeerling like him. He looked both ways, looked again, took a big deep breath and jumped in. He quickly settled himself in between the boxes and prepared for the takeoff that would soon come. He looked out between the gaps in the parcels and saw Santa climb up onto his seat. He thought he saw him put the magic key in its keyhole, but couldn't be sure. Then he felt the sleigh begin to tremble. Without any further delay, Santa roared at the top of his voice. Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas! Rudolph, let's go! Rudolph called the other reindeers to attention with a magnificent roar himself. But before he gave the final order to move, he looked around to see if he could spot the little reindeer. But he was nowhere to be seen. That's odd, thought Rudolph. But time was pressing, so he got down to business. He pulled forward and the other reindeers followed. Tink felt the sleigh lurch forward and pick up speed. And as it sped along the takeoff strip, there was that noise again that was both loud and quiet, and the sleigh was once again surrounded by blue light. Then, with one final lurch from side to side, they were up off the ground and zooming skywards. Tink knew straight away it was going to be a bumpy ride because the sleigh was pushed and pulled by the wind in all directions. So he hunkered down and closed his eyes, waiting for the first stop on the delivery run. Soon he felt drowsy. Was he tired? He didn't think so. Or perhaps it was the magic of the sleigh which makes all children sleepy as it passes by. And that was the last thought he had as he fell asleep. Tink didn't know how long he was asleep for, but he was awakened by a massive jolt which went through the sleigh. Then the sleigh began to dive down really quickly. He heard Santa's voice boom over the noise of the wind. Prepare for an emergency landing. Then it was Rudolph's voice. Okay, this is it everyone. 100 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet, 30, 20, 10. With that, the sleigh landed heavily on the snow-covered ground and suddenly everything went quiet. Tink crawled out from his hiding place and peered around towards the front of the sleigh. Santa stood there talking to Rudolph and the other reindeers, and he was rubbing his beard thoughtfully. Tink crawled a bit closer and overheard Santa say, Without the heart key we can't fly, and if we can't fly, we can't deliver presents to all the children around the world. But what happened to it? Said Rudolph. Santa shrugged his shoulders and said, I can only think it fell out of the sleigh when we were being tossed around by the wind. That's why the sleigh couldn't keep flying and we had to make a crash landing. Tink was horrified. The heart key was lost. What would happen to Christmas now? Tink couldn't help himself and cried, Oh no! Suddenly all eyes were upon him. What on earth are you doing here, reindeerling? Said Rudolph in a serious voice. Yes, said Santa. Explain yourself, young Tink. Tink bowed his head and said, I'm sorry, Santa. I just wanted so much to help on Christmas Eve. I wanted to help deliver all of those presents and make all of the children happy. Santa nodded his head and smiled. Rudolph also looked more kindly at Tink now. Well, said Santa, there will be nothing to help with if we don't have the magical heart key to make the sleigh fly. Christmas will have to be cancelled and all of the children around the world will go without their presents. Tink was now close to tears. How could Christmas be cancelled? It just can't be. Then he had an idea. Suddenly his face brightened and the tears never came. Santa, he said, I think I may know a way to save Christmas. All of the reindeers, including Rudolph, turned towards him with wide eyes. And just how are you going to do that, young fellow? Said Santa, also with wide eyes. Tink put on his most serious face. Santa, you said the key was made from part of the heart of the world, didn't you? Santa nodded. Tink went on. Well, you said that I had a big heart too. Maybe I can make the sleigh fly instead of the key. Santa smiled and shook his head. That's a lovely thought, Tink, but I just don't think it will be enough. There was now a tear in Santa's eye. Then Rudolph stepped forward and said, "Hold on, Santa. Isn't it worth a try? We have no other plan, so what do we have to lose?" Santa looked like he wasn't too sure, but finally said, "Okay, let's give it a go. Climb up onto my seat beside me, young Tink, and place your little hoof where the key should be." Tink jumped up and did as Santa had asked, and all of the reindeers fell into line with Rudolph at the front. They all waited, hoping something would happen, but sadly nothing did. Santa patted Tink on the head and said, "Nice try, Tink, but I'm afraid there's no hope." Tink wanted to cry, but Rudolph turned to him and said, "Wait, Tink. Tell me, what are you thinking about?" Tink frowned and said, "Making the sleigh fly, of course. Why?" Rudolph winked and said, "Try this. Try thinking about how much we love all the children around the world and how much Christmas means to all of us." Tink nodded and then frowned in concentration. At first there was nothing, but then the noise, both loud and quiet at the same time, began, and a magical blue light surrounded the sleigh. "Good grief!" cried Santa. "He's done it! Christmas may be saved yet." Rudolph strained against his harness and said, "Let's go! We've no time to waste." The sleigh lurched forward and was soon in the air, climbing high above the clouds. Tink sat beside Santa and looked in wonder at what was happening. Faster and faster they went until things began to get rather blurry for Tink. He saw different countries flashing by as fast could be. Every now and again Santa jumped off the sleigh and seemed to become a dance of pure light as he flew down one chimney after another. Tink had never seen anything move so quickly. Soon each country flashed past so quickly that they all began to look the same to Tink, and he felt his eyes begin to droop. But he made sure he kept his hoof exactly where the heart key should be, and they flew on through the night. Eventually Tink fell asleep and dreamed of children around the world opening their presents on Christmas morning. The next thing he knew, everything was bright, and as he opened his eyes he realised he was in his own bed. He jumped up and ran outside, wondering if the whole of his adventure on Christmas Eve had been one big dream. He ran through the deep snow to the sleigh shed and found Rudolph standing outside grazing on some hay. "Rudolph, Rudolph," he cried. "Did we save Christmas? Did we?" Rudolph looked at Tink and tried to be serious, but he just couldn't manage it and smiled the biggest smile Tink had ever seen. At that moment all of the other reindeers came out of the shed, followed by all of the elves, Tink's mum and dad, and finally Santa. Santa walked up to Tink and said, "Yes, young reindeer, you saved Christmas. We couldn't have done it without you." Santa had something behind his back, and when he brought his hand around, Tink saw something glittering there. Santa bent forward and patted Tink on the head and then pinned something on Tink's chest. When Tink looked down, he saw it was a set of wings just like Rudolph and the other sleigh reindeers wore. "You did save Christmas, Tink," said Santa, "and everyone here is proud of you. For such a little reindeer, you have a huge heart, and that's what saved the day." Tink blushed with pride as everyone clapped and his mum and dad moved forward to hug him. From that day on, Tink became known as the little reindeer with such a big heart who saved Christmas. But that was many Christmases ago, and now Tink is all grown up and flying with the rest of Santa's reindeers. So as you lie in your bed on Christmas Eve, remember that your presents are safe with Tink and will always be there on Christmas morning.